Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video. This is a Ukraine Frontline update, first one in 10 days, so it's a 10-day update. Expect there to be a lot of movement on the front line. Just to remind you that the blue pins, I have two mappers. Andrew Perpetua has a lighter colours, Syriac Mapsu pro-Russian mapper has a darker colours. The blue pins represent the movement of the Russian defensive line further back in favor of Ukraine, and the red, sort of cherry red and pink colors represent the movement forward for the Russians in terms of their defensive line moving forward, and the dark ones being Syriac maps and the light ones being Andrew Perpetua. So we're going to start up in Sumy, where you can see there has been some gains up here, have been some gains for the Ukrainians. Indication from Andrew Perpetua, the light blue pins, suggesting that in this area where we have seen the Ukrainians take control of Kindrativka again, Andriivka, and they're trying to take Oleksivka. They've had some success going into Varochina, but then possibly being pushed back, according to the Russians, but there's a bit of disagreement there. Just between Kindrativka and Oleksivka, north of Andriivka, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back further towards the border. There was this fighting concerning this kind of lake here, sort of like a large river course that splits in two there. The Ukrainians were pushing the Russians back, and they pushed them to the water. There was supposedly, times when there are lots of dead bodies in the water, reports of Russians taking some pretty heavy casualties around here. They had a bit of a problem trying to supply Kindrativka and this area because, of course, trying to supply a town that you were in control of without being able to come from this direction means you have to come from the north. But if you cut the road off here and the Ukrainians are moving in an easterly direction, then it becomes very difficult to supply Kindrativka. So that's why that was eventually lost. And you can imagine that the Russians really aren't going to have much success in holding on to an area of land where they're backed onto the water. So there's no surprise that they've been pushed back there, but then subsequently past where the water is, as according to Andrew Perpetua, and this might put Oleksivka in a more vulnerable position too, as supply to that settlement gets more and more difficult. Now, Grayskull, this is going back to September the 27th, so this is kind of 9 days ago. The AFU advanced northeast of Kindrativka in the Sumy region, and that's pretty much where we're talking about, to be perfectly frank. So that's this kind of area. If you look at the water, that's the water course. So that's the Ukrainians pushing the Russians all the way back to here, and now it seems that there's been some further success there. And then we hear this is just out tonight. So the mappers, this might not be reflecting on the mappers at all, on the maps at all, but this is the Ukrainians advancing east of Andriivka in the Sumy region. Well, Andriivka's down here, so that's not quite sure what's going on there. We have Andriivka with that water course. I'm not sure if this is, I think it, yeah, that's Andriivka. So sorry, it's east of Andriivka. Yes, that's right. So this is, sorry, this is forgetting. I did look at this and then subsequently forgot. So you are seeing the Ukrainians actually push into Oleksivka. This is Aleksivka, depending on how it's transcribed. But the Ukrainians pushing eastwards into this area here, and that is pretty significant. You can see that they are in control of this area just on the southern tip of that green field, and then going westwards. So that's this area here. Now, that is significant. Andrew Perpetua has a Russian defensive line, actually, where it would have previously been, so somewhere around here, but then according to Grayskull, the Ukrainians are pushed further to the east. So now this grey zone, or even into Andrew Perpetua's Russian control zone, the Ukrainians have pushed. So this looks like a drive towards taking Oleksivka. It's taken some time. The Ukrainians were having some pretty good success around here, and they've kind of it's been stabilized there. There's been no move since then. Anyway, no change to the rest of that kind of area. We are hearing that the Russians are pushing in. So just to let you know where we are, this is Kharkiv. So we're up in Sumy Oblast. We're now moving along to Kharkiv. And there are claims that the Russians are pressuring in this area, maybe trying to join these two sectors up where they've got to cross the Oskil River that comes down here. So the Oskil River comes down here and then goes all the way south down here. And that's where the Russians are trying to fill in this area up to the Oskil River. And then they've also got into this area around Milove here. And they might be putting some pressure between these two areas along the border there. But also Vovchansk, which has been fairly stable for some time. It looks like the Russians are starting to put some pressure back on in this area, trying to get further south of the river. So you've got the river Vovcha that meanders around here. And then the Ukrainians had kept the Russians back in the center of town here, but the Russians have been trying to creep further south, and they've done so according to Syriac maps in this area, pushing down there, but also I think having some success in the area south of the river, further to the west. Massive difference between what Andrew Perpetua and Syriac maps states is the case here. But I think the Russians may well be trying to put some pressure on there. It almost feels like they're trying to press in a whole host of places like they have done previously. You know, press everywhere, that deep battle doctrine where you attack everywhere, and as soon as you find a weakness, you then pile into there. Now, there are claims that the Russians have taken control of half of Kupiansk and half of Pokrovsk. These are Russian claims, and then there's been some controversy over this, with Russian mill bloggers getting pretty angry that there are claims that they've taken half of Kupiansk when that's not true. So it's a very common occurrence, this, isn't it, where the Russian commanders say they've taken X or Y, and then, you know, to try and please their superiors, and then, you know, when they haven't actually done that but claim they have, eventually reality comes and bites them on the arse, and then they have to quickly try and take a place to prove that they do actually have it, and then that causes them to lose more troops than they otherwise would have done, because they're doing it in a rushed fashion. Don't know if that's what's going on in Kupiansk, but there are certainly Russian claims that they are controlling half of the town. And as you can see, there's a huge difference between what Syriac maps and Andrew Perpetua says is going on here. So Andrew Perpetua, the more objective mapper, has a Russian defensive line all around here. There's a thin blue line that you can see, and indeed all the way back here. So you can see there's a massive difference of opinion between what's going on in this whole sector. Syriac maps much more charitable to the Russians. Wherever they claim they've been, he says they now control. So even if you have one single Russian human being walking in a particular place, then that means that the Russians fully control that area. He has the Russians having now, you know, advance all the way down into this area south of the road, coming down here, and really circling around the main part of the city to the west. But I'm not sure how true that is. But there are lots of claims concerning the Russian success here. We'll have to see how it materializes. Yeah, those two for this sector are much further to the south. So we'll keep an eye on Kupiansk, but it's not looking great there. It has to be said. So I do worry about the front lines in general. I think there have been some successes for the Ukrainians in particular points on the front. We might say Sumy is one of them, where the Ukrainians are doing well. The part of the Dobropilia sector, they're doing well, but elsewhere around there, the Russians are really pushing. And actually, right in this whole, we're gonna look at a time-lapse video of the mapping of this whole area, and you'll see that really the Russians are taking a pretty sizable chunk of territory here, meanwhile pushing in a number of other places too. So, you know, the difficulty for the Ukrainians is they have to take this land back, and it's much more difficult for the Ukrainians to take the land back militarily than it is for the Russians to control it, to take it in the first place, because the Russians are willing to expend stupendous amounts of people to take relatively small areas of land, and the Ukrainians are not willing to make that same calculation. So therefore it just becomes very hard. It's kind of asymmetrical there, where they're almost both, each side is operating on a different kind of set of rules for war. And that means that the Russians have an advantage for taking land, is a disadvantage in terms of losing troops, but they don't care about that. They just care about the land. And this is why I keep saying that for Ukraine to militarily succeed, they need, I think, Russia to economically collapse back in Russia, and to absolutely hammer the crap out of Russia with distance weapons. They also, I think, desperately need aviation to drop oodles of guided glide bombs right across the front lines to hammer the crap out of the Russians. Until all of those things happen, the Ukrainians, I think, are really going to struggle to take vast amounts of land, well, much land back at all. Where they do have success, they grind and grind and grind. It's just really difficult because you've got established positions. You know, when they are losing positions, the Ukrainians, these are positions that are covered in trench lines, right? So when they have to take them back, the Russians are adopting the Ukrainian defensive lines that they've spent ages building, and it is just really difficult. I know there are lots of people thinking, oh, the Ukrainians could easily take land back and there can be military success. I think it's increasingly more difficult the longer the war goes on, because they just don't have the troops. They just don't have the large number of troops. And if they are going to do some big kind of push, some big offensive, it'll be in one particular area, but that's arguably not going to help them. Well, it depends. It depends whether that's at all possible, whether the Ukrainians do have any kind of reserves that they are getting ready to strike in a given place. You'd hope it would pull Russian troops away, but then the Ukrainians would need troops in these other places in order to push back. So, yeah, it's just very, very difficult for the Ukrainians. It really is. That's not to say the Russians are going to win or are winning. I mean, they are losing stupendous amounts of people. It's just, you know, there are no clear winners in this military battle. I think it's who loses the least badly. Right. Anyway, that said, there are some small gains for the Ukrainians to the west of Tabaivka there, according to Andrew Perpetua. And then when we come down past the Pishchani sector, which actually has been really stable, this whole area, where the Russians got all the way to the Oskil River and then, you know, expanded a little bit, but they've pretty much been stuck in this sector for quite a long time. Ukraine is pushed back in Lozova. Now, according to Surat maps, the Russians are pushing on actually now west of Lozova and down at Zeleny High there, trying to push towards the Oskil River in this direction. Just trying to see where these, so this is Yampil and Karpivka. So some small gains further to the south. Anyway, so according to Surat maps, Russians gaining there, but, you know, pinch of salt and all that. Then we're going to come to Karpivka. So this is where there might have been some success for the Ukrainians in taking a little bit of land back there. That is sort of in this kind of general area, but no change to the map is here, because actually Andrew Perpetua already has that area as grey zone anyway, so you wouldn't see that turn up on the grey zone. It's Ukrainians taking control of grey zone area. You should see that reflected in Surat maps, but it's not there. And actually this was from quite a long time ago, that's 6-7 days ago, so no change from Surat maps there, which is interesting. Then we are going to come further to the south, where we are looking at Novoselivka here. Ukrainians having a tiny bit of success there, but essentially the Russians making some gains too. But as you can see here, just vast differences of opinion between Andrew Perpetua. So the blue lines here, Andrew Perpetua's Russian defensive lines. And then all of this lighter shaded area is the difference between Surat maps as a pro-Russian mapper and what Andrew Perpetua is saying. So just huge differences around here. Surat maps just making, you know, signifying gains for the Russians all over the shop. And this seems to be a repeated pattern we see across the front line. Now, it's not to say that the Russians aren't having successes there and they aren't pushing on. A lot of these will be grey zones that then eventually do become Russian controlled, because the direction of travel is fairly consistently one way with the Russians, and they're just pushing everywhere until they do actually take control of somewhere. So at first you see the odd DRG, deep reconnaissance group, and Russians, and you say, and Surat maps will say, look, they control that, and they don't actually control that. But often they do end up controlling it some weeks later properly. Now, there's a lot of talk about Yampil. So the Russians claimed that they took Yampil, or there were some claims from the Russians, from some Russians, that they'd taken control of Yampil here, which is to the west of the Serebyansky Forest, where the Ukrainians did this withdrawal out of the Serebyansky Forest and kind of lost it. The whole lot just was lost very, very quickly. But I think it was a case of, not so much being beaten out there, but deciding it was not worth their while staying there while the Russians were making these gains to the south and obviously controlled to the north. They didn't want to be cut off in the forest in this area. So they pulled back there. And then you've got Liman very close here. I've been to Liman, I do believe. Yes, I have. I think. And then you've got Yampil just between Liman and the Serebyansky Forest, and that is what the Russians claim that they have taken. If you counterattacked east of Yampil in the Liman direction on the 26th, but actually we are hearing now there are claims today. In fact, if I go and do a search for Yampil, there are quite a few claims that the Ukrainians have retaken Yampil. In fact, I have it. I didn't do my update. I was out today, and I did have some updates to add, which I haven't yet done. In fact, it was Tim White that was saying that Yampil had been retaken, if I remember correctly. Sorry about this, I should have had this prepped. Ukraine's army says it's pushed out invaders from the village of Yampil. Russians entered the eastern fringes of the town 3 weeks ago, 14th of September, and even claimed to have taken control of most of Yampil. But the idea is that the Ukrainians claim to have taken it back. We have... a couple of hours ago, Michael McKay saying, this is a Canadian, in the Seversk direction in Donetsk region, the Ukrainians repelled 16 enemy attacks near Hirivka and towards Yampil and Dronivka. Another attack is ongoing. So lots of activity around there, but claims that they have, 4 hours ago, Ukrainian warriors have completed the elimination of the occupiers in Yampil. I don't know this source at all. Quote, the situation there has stabilized. The work to destroy the remnants of the occupiers has been completed, emphasized a spokesperson of the East Military Group. Actually, that is coming from a military source there. So they're claiming that they've pushed the Russians out of Yampil. But as you can see around Seversk, the Ukrainians really getting pushed back, Russians creeping towards Seversk, definitely worrying up there. I'm going to be quite quick now with the rest of the update, apart from, when we're down south of Pokrovsk. There are some claims that, Ukrainians might have had, might be pushing back the Russians a little to the southeast of Konstantinivka, but Andrew Perpetua has the Russians not hugely further forward there. I mean, it's not like what Syriac Maps has, which is the Russians really encroaching upon Konstantinivka. And again, just all around this whole front, just a huge difference of opinion as to what is going on there. I can't remember if I have any sources for this particular area. No, that's what we're going to look at later. No, so we're really going on to Dobropilia. So as we come on to what's often been called the bunny ears, remember that, even though that Syriac Maps has a contiguous controlled area of the Russian Federation here, that he claims that the Russians are actually increasing control as well over the last 10 days of this sort of bunny ears. It's not really the bunny ears here, it's one just big salient. But if we get the pen out, it essentially, as you probably already know, it looks something like these were two bunny ears that look like that. Well, then actually, no, it's further to the south. So it's more like this and like that. Eventually they got cut into two, and they were called the bunny ears. But now you've essentially got a surrounded area up here, a surrounded area in the middle, and possibly another area down there, but also possibly an area there. So it depends. There are different interpretations, but these encircled areas in in this region. Surek maps admitting that the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back in a number of these areas. Nikhanarivka, Ivanivka, Novoshakovye, you've got Shakovye over here. And further down here, Novotoretska, just down here. So if we run through some of the sources here, so this is going back to the 29th, a good week ago, Ukraine is pushed down into Novotoretska. That's this area here. But you can see that, keep going to the wrong one. Right in Novotoretska and the grey line going south, that is not what Surek Maps thinks here, as they are far more charitable to the Russians in that area, but that was some time ago. And then this is generally what is thought of as happening around these settlements. You've got Novotoretska there, and you've got the Ukrainians coming down from Shakova, and then coming from the west over here. So cutting off at the neck around Mayak and Pankivka there. North of Boykivka, also so Boykivka and Novotoretska, actually, some claiming that they control those settlements as well. So cutting off that neck and forcing the Russians to resupply using drones. So that's the claim in this area. A lot of grey zone. It is actually a lot more dynamic, though, than some people suggest. So other analysts have said, look, when you see these kind of areas of shaded in territory, it's not really like that, and it's really dynamic's probably the wrong word, but there's just people leaking in and out all over the place, and there's no definite control of some of these areas in the way that you might think. It's not like people are standing in fields with flags saying, we own this field and they own that field. Bunny Ears update. This is from October the 2nd, so sort of 4 days ago. The FU advanced west of Kucherev Yar. So that's taking really the Bunny Ears down to one very small ear on the right there. But it's amazing that the Russians are still present up here, because we heard like a month ago that they were being surrounded in this area. And of course, they've managed to hold on. Testament possibly to amazingly getting supplies up to these people. They have piled all sorts of reserves and resources into trying not to let this disaster happen. But it has been very tough on those Russians. So cutting them off south around here. So it's really looking like actually two major areas of encirclement. And here we have another interpretation. Bunny Ears, the Ukrainians advance west of Shakovye in the Dobropilya direction. So we go back to my map. This will be just in this kind of area. Shakovye, if we go back to that map. So Shakovye here, north of Volodymyrivka. So it's in this kind of area that the Ukrainians have had some success of calling to Grey Skull here, and actually quite an incision into the Russian controlled spaces there. And then that's what they previously said that they're taking control of, and then the Ukrainians making some gains just north of there, up in this kind of area. But not represented here by what Surek Maps is saying. Interestingly, Andrew Perpetua has this entire area just as grey zone. He doesn't have that. He doesn't have any of it in Russian control, because it was just too difficult to really be able to assert that they fully controlled any of that area. Although there is obviously quite a lot of Russian presence in those areas, but it's just too difficult to work out who actually controls each kind of area. So anyway, that is still ongoing. There's still this fight for either to completely surround and eliminate the Russians here, or for the Russians to keep supplying those troops that are there, and all the while trying to push further to the north west in an attempt to kind of encircle Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk. Right, so then when we come down to, so the Russians have also been pushing back at a couple of places around here, Novoekonomichna, this kind of area, pushing back to the south of there. And I think there has been because remember, this all started when the Ukrainians made this amazing attack deep into Myrna, and they broke all the way deep into Russian territory here. But it's all a bit murky as to exactly what's going on there, and I haven't been following things as closely as I would like to have done. Now, there are claims that the Russians are moving up into Myrnafred. I might get my little might do a bit of drawing now. So there are claims that the Russians are actually pushing into Myrnafred. It's interesting to listen to Scruffy Tails talk about this. He said this is kind of pointless because you can waste a lot of troops trying to take Myrnafred, or if you really are serious about taking Pokrovsk, which they are, if you actually end up taking all of Pokrovsk, what that does is it cuts off the supply to Myrnafred, right? Because this basically gets interdicted, and then there's no point staying here. Like if the Russians control Pokrovsk, then the Ukrainians will pull out of, they'll pull out of get out of Dodge, pull out of Myrnafred. So there's no point trying to take Myrnafred. There's no point fighting in two cities because that's a really expensive thing to do. So they really should be thinking about fighting in one city and that being a success, and then that forces the Russians out of Myrnafred. So, but trying to attack two cities at the same time is quite expensive and not very sensible. Alas, it appears that they are moving up this road, as there are indications that there are lots of, I think there's lots of shelling and attacks and whatnot. So it looks like the Russians are. In fact, if we look at Andrew Petcher's map, he might signify, I know when Scruffy Tails was doing this on his mapping, he was talking about a different mapper. Actually, no, Andrew's got it here as well. So this is exactly what we're talking about. So this attack up into Myrnafred here, we have Russian helicopter shelling, all sorts of attacks going on up here, which would suggest they are seeking to move up this road and into Myrnafred, beat the Ukrainians back in that direction. I wonder if there's anything previously to suggest activity prior to that. No, interesting. Okay. But the theory is that's a bit of a waste of time and just concentrate on this Pokrovsk over there. Right. Anyway, sorry, where was I? Just need to make sure I know where I am. Right. So that Playfra, who's a pretty good source for what's going on. We're going to look now slightly more closely at Pokrovsk. Suret maps claiming that the Russians are controlling quite a lot of Pokrovsk now, and that they have infiltrated into both the south but also the western outskirts of Pokrovsk. This is another claim that, rather like Kupiansk, is being contested. Playfra says, and this is fairly recent, this is from today, Pokrovsk city, contrary to what many mappers draw, he says, the only problematic area is the Lazerny district of the city, which is mostly in the grey zone. So let's have a little look there. Yeah, so on my map, that would be this area to the south of the city. It's sort of this area is the Lazerny area, as far as I can work out, I think. Yeah, so that appears to be this area. He says that's the main area that is a problem. Remember, previously they'd gone up through Leontovici, up through Troyanda, and then be pushed back there. So this is slightly further to the east. But anyway, here we have, so yeah, that's where I was just showing you this kind of area here. The Lazerny district of the city, which is mostly in the grey zone. The grey zone started forming some time ago in the Zelenivka district and slowly continued into Lazerny without a sudden breakthrough. Shakhtarsky and Pivdeny districts situated just north of Lazerny are currently holding. So if we go in here, that's Shakhtarsky there. So these areas are holding apparently. And this, the Russians came, gradually into this area. So yeah, into this area, but the Ukrainians are holding up here. although the situation is very difficult there for the Ukrainians. The key to the city is not Lazerny as much as Shakhtarsky. If the Russians can gain a foothold there, it will be hard to hold further ground in the low-rise buildings north of the district. Regarding the Dobropilya direction, okay, so that then goes on to Dobropilya. My sources continue to strictly observe OPSEC. I do not have any information regarding that area, which is quite interesting. Yeah, so it's not as bad, and Playfry is pretty brutally honest about what goes on, and to say that, you know, here's your main problem, and kind of really not mentioning any of this suggests that there might be deep reconnaissance groups or the odd like person that gets in and infiltrates into the city, but it's not the big bombastic claims that the Russians think it is. Andrew Perpetua saying that, the Russians do control some of these areas, getting closer to the city, but everything else is basically a grey zone, which is probably far more accurate. It is more conservative, but these are dynamic operations that are taking place. Udachne, Andrew Perpetua saying that the Russians back in control of that. This has yo-yoed a number of times, as has Kotlina as well, north of the railway that skirts past this area. So Ukrainians lost that again. And then we come down to this whole area much further south of Pokrovsk, the Novopavlivka area, but actually it seems to be fairly stable between Novopavlivka and Pokrovsk, so this set of the front line. But as you get to Ivanivka up here, going all the way down, it's not looking good, is it? Russians, according to both mappers, pushing forward fairly consistently along this whole front there. Andrew Perpetua and Suret Maps claiming that there might be some success for the Ukrainians around Novoselivka. There's a couple of settlements here. Sosnivka is one of them, Novoselivka, and I think this one, Sichneve there. So it could be that the Ukrainians have pushed back and retaken these settlements. We're going to look at that in this last source here, which is Grayskull again, saying Sosnivka, Novoselivka and Sichneve, there you go, have come under control of the defense forces of Ukraine. So that's pushing, he has the Ukrainians actually fully controlling Sichneve there, getting into there, which is sort of aligned more with Andrew Perpetua, less so with Syriac Maps. And then we have it's not looking good for the rest of that front, as the Russians, making consistent gains there. What I'm going to do is go back to this, and I'm just going to show you. I might speed it up a wee bit actually, because it's 3 minutes and we don't need it to go at the speed it goes naturally. Let's do it 1.5 times speed, and let's just look at the whole of the front line. So I'm going to pause it for a second. Just talk about these areas. So this is going back. I was trying to move the map there. This is going back right to 2023, June 2023. So Avdiivka had not fallen yet. That was kind of October onwards area where it just fell, and then it fell relatively quickly. But what's significant is, this whole area out to Pokrovsk, there's Pokrovsk, that's what the Russians have taken. But it's this area down here to Velika Novosilka, it's just coming all the way out here that I'm quite worried about. I think the Russians have bled for everything, right? But I think they've had a slightly easier time of things. I mean, nothing's easy in war, is it? But taking this kind of area here, possibly because it's fairly absent of large settlements, they seem to have, been quite quick there. So have a look at that. The date will change up here. We're now moving quite quickly. The Ukrainians were countering. They were taking Velika Novosilka. This is during the counteroffensive in 2023 that went on from May. We're now to August 2023. So Ukrainians, we're all thinking, yay, awesome. And you got Vuhledar down here. And then slowly it sort of started turning around. And the Russians started pushing in Mariinka. If you remember, half of Mariinka was the Russians and half the Ukrainians, and then Avdiivka suddenly fell. Mariinka was holding on for ages, and then that fell, and then this kind of precipitated a very quick, not very quick, relative to the war, pretty quick taking of all of this area for the Russians, and then just the consistent grind here towards Karakova. As you can see, fairly speedy down here, really. Fall of Ukraine, fall of Frodivka, fall of Vuhledar, and then the fall of Vuhledar precipitated a really quick taking of this area here, Karakova, Velika Novosilka eventually, and then they just filled in an awful lot of land around here. Yeah, I think the Russians have found this a lot easier in this kind of area than, you know, having to fight through larger settlements, and all of it's very costly. But of course, once they've got this land, the Ukrainians have to get it back, and it either comes at a huge military cost, I think that's unlikely, or a huge diplomatic cost. It just depends, you know, if, like I said earlier, if the Russians have completely capitulated economically, then that's the best chance the Ukrainians have of being able to have an awful lot more leverage. But I mean, just, you know, we were talking about Vuhledar for so long, if you remember, all the way back when, and look at the distance now going east to west. Just, you know, okay, when you look at the whole of the map of Ukraine, it's not that much, but compared to other areas of the front line, I think the Russians have had the most success around Velika Novosilka, Vuhledar, this bottom of the Donetsk front, and it's probably the area that I've talked about the least. You know, we talk so much about Pokrovsk up here, and Toretska, and all these other places, but this whole area here, there's Vuhledar all the way back there. This purple line, you know, you look at the yellow trench lines, these are the Surovikin lines, you know, the previous commander of the Russian forces that built these defensive lines, and that gives you a good indication where the Russians were and what the Russians have taken since then. And the largest movements from east to west is in this very southern part of the Donetsk region, going on to Zaporizhia. So yeah, that's where we are. It is challenging for the Ukrainians. They need, in my opinion, is way more aviation. They need much more of an advantage along the front lines and just hammer the crap out of the Russian positions with guided glide bombs. They need to scale up the production, scale up the procurement, get more planes, and do to the Russians what the Russians did to Ukraine. So the speed with which the Russians they took Avdiivka was down to guided glide bombs. That's the main reason they took Avdiivka back, or not. They took Avdiivka, sorry, not back. You know, this has held on for so long, since 2014, and then guided glide bombs. They just absolutely rinsed the Ukrainians there, and then they had a couple of tunnel scenarios and whatnot. But yeah, they did lose an awful lot of equipment themselves and troops. It was very costly for them, but it was precipitated by guided glide bombs. And so the Ukrainians need to do that back to the Russians. They need to hammer those trench lines. Anyway, that's my tuppence. When we go further along the lines, there are a couple of areas of change. Surat maps suggest that near Malotokmachka, the Ukrainians maybe have pushed a little bit, pushed the Russians a little bit further back, and then around Stepnohirsk, Surat maps has the Russians taking a sliver of territory there, but nothing really to shout about. Luckily, that appears to stabilize somewhat, because you don't want them getting closer and closer to Zaporizhia. Zaporizhia is getting hammered by guided glide bombs, though. So as are all of these Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. I think Sloviansk was hit tonight. It's hellish around all of these places. Kramatorsk, this was where there was the fiber optic drone that was flying through Kramatorsk. I mean, that's scary stuff. Anyway, that's Frontline update. That was a full-on 10-day update, so a lot of change there. I would like to do these more often. It's just time. There's only one of me. So hopefully that was informative. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.